All right, y'all, welcome back. This is going to be Chapter 4, International Relations Theory, probably the most important chapter of the first unit. So pay special attention. This is where we're starting to build the theories, right? So you really have three buckets of theories, but we're going to focus on just the first bucket for the most part, right? So the three buckets are the traditional theories. So this is liberalism and realism, which we're going to hit pretty hard. The second bucket is the middle ground theory. So you have the English school and constructivism. And then the third bucket is called critical theory. So this is Marxism, post colonialism, feminism, post structuralism, and others. Okay, so let's go back to one, the traditional theories. First, both of these operate at the state level. You have liberalism rising through the Enlightenment period, through democratization, um, through even World War One and World War Two. The post World War One period with the creation of the League of Nations under Woodrow Wilson, who was the only political scientist ever to have been president. So liberalism is around for, I don't know, 150 or 200 years. It has some basic assumptions. The first assumption is that humans are good, right? And I could have kind of put in parentheses, can be good, right? But it's a different take from the realist perspective, which suggests that like humans are innately warlike. Okay, so liberalism says humans are good and that peace is achievable and often even desirable. And for the most part, this comes from people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher who was sort of responding to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, but also Immanuel Kant, an 18th century German philosopher, brilliant guy who put down a lot of philosophies about a lot of things. Uh, but basically, he says that liberal states, or those states controlled by citizens rather than monarchs, will try to avoid war because citizens don't desire or want to go to war, right? They're a lot less about territorial expansion and things like this than a singular leader would be. And so this brings about, in what we call modern day parlance, democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies do not go to war against each other. And there is a lot of statistical evidence for this, strong statistical evidence that suggests that democracies very, very rarely ever go to war against one another. Um, However, I would add the caveat that democracies are still just as likely to go to war against autocracies as autocracies are to go to war against each other. So democracy doesn't forego war. They just don't war against one another. Also, Immanuel Kant is thought to be the first to offer the idea of trade as a peace mechanism. That states that trade together play together and don't fight. And we also have a lot of really good evidence for this. Um, I would say that the liberal theory, sort of, I guess, before realism kicked in, the peak was the League of Nations, right? Post World War One and the assassination of Franz Ferdinand of Austria. Um, there was a lot of concern about getting Europe to sort of get together so that there would be at least a platform for them to hash out these compromises. Um, and I would say that sort of the modern EU and the modern UN would be good examples of liberalism in practice. Um, I would also say that sort of the US system is a nice representation of liberalism, especially when you contrast it against the Articles of Confederation, which were a miserable failure, right? The Articles of Confederation were all about each country is sort of like on their own, or excuse me, each state, I guess at the time, but they could well have been thought of as like countries, is on their own. We have this sort of weak alliance system, some agreements, but we don't have an overarching military. We don't have any of these things. So once we tossed out the Articles of Confederation, and instilled federalism, but with still a strong federal government, things tended to get a lot more smooth, right? There's also some historical precedents here for liberalism and it actually working, right? So you've got the post World War II peace, especially between, like I said earlier, democracies and states that trade with each other. You've got treaties, which have worked rather well in the post World War II period. You've got things like EU and NATO and ASEAN, which is like the Southeastern Asian sort of trading bloc. You've got Mercosur, which is like the South American trading bloc. You've got NAFTA, which is now the USMCA. Trump rejiggered it. It's not really any different, let's be real, but we've got NAFTA, um, or the USMCA now, the US Mexican Canadian agreement. Okay, so um, where did realism come about? Realism, which is sort of the alternative to liberalism, this is the other sort of traditional idea of international relations. Realism comes as a consequence of the failure of the League of Nations post World War One, right? We get the Great Depression, we get World War II, millions dead, states, you know, set on the track to war with each other all across the entire world, Northern Africa, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, like it was just everywhere, right? And I would also point out that realism also has some interesting, like real world precedents too. So I don't think anyone could point to one or the other theory and says this is the end all be all. It works in every circumstance, right? So if you look at like the Peloponnesian War, one of my master's degrees was in military strategy and diplomacy, and so we read a treatise on the Peloponnesian War um, from the Greeks, right? And basically, I can't remember if it was Thebes or Athens came to Peloponnesia and said, basically bow and give us your women and slaves, or we will destroy you. And they did, because the Peloponnesians didn't bow, and they were basically completely massacred, right? And so this is sort of a strong indicator in history of like sometimes compromise can be for the best, right? You've also got Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which I think is a pretty realist document, right? Um, and then I would point out like modern day Congo, right? There you can see Eritrea, Rwanda, all the states around them acting very voraciously to steal their resources, land, mines, things like that. So, sort of a good indicator of when realism is in play. Some of the assumptions of realism are that humans are not innately good, right? It does not take this sort of holier than thou perspective on human behavior, especially group human behavior, right? And that we are not innately good. It takes a much more sort of rationalistic Homo economicus view of the self-rational man, right? Like, or the self-rational state or leader or whatever it might be. Like, how do we maximize benefits and minimize costs or detriments to our society, whatever it might be. Uh, they also are the ones that say like we live in anarchy, right? Not like bombing buildings, kind of anarchism, in the sense of philosophy, but in the sense that there is no supranational entity that can control people and whose rules we have to follow or who can enforce those rules, right? Like the UN has lots of rules, but can they enforce them? Not really. So, because states live in a system of anarchy, they must always be prepared for war, whether it be expansion, defense of the nation, troop mobilization, technological prowess, etc. And this is one of the things that leads to things like arms races, right? And if you're interested at all in a brilliant movie, one of my favorite of all times, I would say it's like 70 years old, but it's by one of the world's most famous directors, Stanley Kubrick. Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Love the Bomb, is a really, really cool um, international relations movie. It's fun, it's weird, but also there's a lot of IR theory in play, which he talks about in a lot of his interviews. So, really interesting stuff. All right, we'll touch on these next ones a little bit, but what I really want us to be able to focus on is liberalism versus realism. So, learn those really well. Okay, next we'll move to the next bucket, right? Middle ground theory. So we have the English school. Um, it basically says, like, all right, we're taking a middle ground. Like, yeah, we do kind of live in an anarchic system, and realism makes sense, but there is also some of liberalism that makes sense, right? Like, we live in a society of states, right? The West versus the rest, or BRICS, or whatever these groupings of states might be, they also have influence above just the singular state level, right? They generally assume that there is anarchy at the international level, but that this does not imply that there are no norms of behavior for states, right? And so, we could point out treaties, alliances, trade deals, human rights conventions, all of this sort of stuff. All right. Constructivism is a weird one. I've never really been able to wrap my head around it 100%. But okay, the quote here is that it highlights the importance of values and shared interests between the individuals who interact on the global stage. And this is famously propounded by Alexander Wendt. And he says the relationship between agents, the individuals, and structures, such as the state, is one in which structures not only constrain agents but also construct their identities and interests. So, my way of sort of explaining this is that there's this push and pull between the state, yes, but also the other states that they interact with, the international organizations they interact with, and also the powerful players in their society. So they're all sort of shaping expectations and cultures and things like that between each other at all these different levels, right? This is a bit more of a sort of individualistic level that looks at sort of leaders and things like this rather than just the state, like we've talked about earlier. Okay, what are the critical theories of international relations? I'd say the biggest one is probably Marxism, right? This comes from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto and their other writings from the mid 1800s. This is industrialization and urbanization are really kicking off across Europe. Um, they theorize the world as not a split between states or even the state versus the individual, but rather between what they term the proletarians, who are the workers of the world, and the bourgeoisie, who are the elites and those who own the means of production, right? Um, and so this can be applied in a few different ways in IR, right? So we have theories about sort of central versus peripheral. This is from a guy originally in the 70s, a guy named of Wallerstein. But Wallerstein sort of takes at least a tangential Marxist approach and says that you have this core of very powerful, very rich states, which uses its power and the institutions like IMF, World Bank, UN, etc., to ensure that developing states never are able to develop to their level, so that they're able to exploit them for resources, cheap labor, things like this, right? And because they don't want more competitors at their level. So that's one way that Marxism can be applied. The other way is, or at least one other way, is sort of a criticism of the state-centric model, and that it's a facade or a ruse to keep the working class proletariat across the planet from uniting against the bourgeois in these states, right? So Marxism. All right, post-colonialism, right, just points out a lot of inequality that colonialism created. It's also sort of related to that sort of central versus peripheral argument that I made earlier, like first versus second or third world nations. I guess we don't really use those terms anymore, but it's easy to get across that way. Another is feminism, right? I guess I don't know, it plays out a lot less as like studies of diplomacy and things instead how the dearth of women in power affects international relations across the world. It has gained ground, but I would say like there are a lot more powerful women as world leaders, presidents, prime ministers, diplomats, economists, whatever, across the planet than there were when a lot of this feminist movement was kickstarting, right? Um, so anyway, okay, and then the final one, post-structuralism, is also kind of bizarre. It's based on the French linguist and philosopher Jacques Derrida, um, and it basically is about like how do we use the words that are said to not only understand their immediate purpose and value and meaning or whatever, but also all the alternative meanings of texts, right? And so we should be trying to delve deeper into the words that are said at the UN or by world leaders or whatever. Dadaism from art sort of comes from the philosophy of Derrida. Um, and he's an interesting guy, but I don't know much about post-structuralism, I'll be honest. All right, section 3, theory and practice, examining the UN. So we're going to learn a little bit how the UN works in this chapter. There's a major distinction to be made between the UN General Assembly, which includes all 193 recognized countries in the world. They all have an equal vote, so that's the UN General Assembly versus the UN Security Council, which is the really powerful apparatus at the UN. It is made up of 15 seats. 10 of them are rotated every 2 or 3 years. I can't remember which. I think it's every 2 years by election. But 5 of them are permanent members and they have veto power, right? So even if it's 14-1 and one of those is a veto state, the rule doesn't pass, right? And so the veto powers are the 5 are the powers around the world standing at the end of World War II, right? So you've got the US, the UK, and France from the Western world. You've got Russia and you've got China. So these are the 5. I would also point out that you'll notice these are also the 5 nuclear states. So people don't talk about that much, but that's part of it, I think. All right. As I mentioned earlier, the UN, there's a lot of flowery stuff, and they do have some power, don't get me wrong, especially through norms and these sorts of things. But they don't really have any enforcement power, right? They don't have a military. If they do put their peacekeepers on the ground, right, the blue hats, um, they can't do like offensive weaponry. They can't carry out military campaigns. They can only play a peacekeeping role. And they're not UN troops. They're member nation troops, right? So it's Kenya's troops representing the UN, or it's Poland's troops representing the UN, not UN troops, right? And so that becomes a problem. Maybe not a problem, but it becomes a difficulty for the UN. For the most part, power is based on member state agreements, right? International pressure, pressure from alliances, publicity from scientists and NGOs, diplomacy and information sharing, mediation, and then the spread of norms, right? So you'll notice that their power is more like granola crunchy than real. Liberals tend to see these agencies as really useful and successful. So, they point to the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, things like that. Realists tend to see it more pessimistically. It would say, looking at those same exact institutions, say, okay, they're weak or exploitative. And also, they're only used by the states insofar as they're valuable. As soon as they're not valuable, they get abandoned, right? Um, all right, yeah, that's all I've got for you on this one. So thanks for being here. I'll see you for chapter 5 next.